In 2004, Hidetaka Miyazaki was 29 years old when he made what might have been the riskiest decision of his life. He gave up his position as an account manager at Oracle to join From Software, which was just a small company at the time, accepting a significant pay cut. His dream was to make games and become a game producer. From Software was impressed by Miyazaki's bold decision to take such a pay cut, believing he showed promise. As a result, they made an exception to hire this 29-year-old newcomer who had absolutely no industry experience. After joining, Miyazaki participated in the development of the company's main product Armored Core series. In 2005, he was just a game designer for Armored Core: Last Raven, but by 2006, he had become the producer for Core 4. This, Armored Core 4, would later become widely discussed as Miyazaki's debut work. In 2008, Miyazaki went on to produce the sequel, Armored Core 4 Answer. Although these two titles didn't make much of a splash in the organic market, with Armored Core 4 Answer only achieving a Metacritic score of 62. At that time, Hidetaka Miyazaki could only be described as unremarkable, and nobody even paid attention to who the game's producer was. Although Miyazaki has never discussed this period in detail to this day, looking at the later massive success of the Souls games, perhaps mech shooting games like Armored Core, as well as sequel games where he couldn't build the worldview and gameplay fundamentals himself, weren't really suited for Miyazaki. In my personal opinion, the second point is particularly important because looking at all the games Miyazaki has developed so far, their most important characteristic is that they carry his very strong personal style, which is precisely what makes them so captivating. Additionally, in an interview with Edge magazine in 2011, Miyazaki said, "During my time at From Software, I had been focusing on developing the Armored Core series, but I always wanted to create a dark fantasy game inspired by the fighting fantasy gamebook series, and the Demon's Souls project was exactly the beginning I had been waiting for." Speaking of Demon's Souls development, Miyazaki played something of a role as a savior in Crisis, turning the tide. Of course, this might be a bit of an exaggeration, but given From Software's situation at the time, Demon's Souls had already been deemed a failed project internally. Miyazaki volunteered to take on this project after hearing about this, willingly taking this hot potato into his hands, because his understanding of the matter was different from others. He was very optimistic about it, feeling that failure wasn't necessarily a bad thing. From another perspective, it might be a very good opportunity. Regarding this point, in 2015, Miyazaki said in an interview with The Guardian, "The project had significant problems, and the team at the time couldn't create a compelling prototype, but when I heard it was a planned action RPG, I was excited. I thought if I could find a way to control the game, I could turn it into anything I wanted. Most importantly, if my ideas failed, nobody would care since the game was already considered a failure." From this, you can see that Miyazaki's view on failure was different from others. He wasn't afraid of failure but rather focused on finding ways to succeed through failure, and this point had a huge impact on his subsequent game development. Souls fans all know that constant failure, constant death, and constantly learning and accumulating experience from failure and death are precisely the core gameplay mechanics of the Souls games. Failure and death are consistent throughout the entire gameplay experience of all Souls games. At this point, some viewers might think I'm overinterpreting. But actually, just this year, Miyazaki said in another interview conducted by Simon Parkin for The Guardian, "Honestly, I feel the current situation isn't much different from when I was making Demon's Souls. As the company president, what I try to ensure in the company is that these young producers and game designers can have experiences similar to when I made Demon's Souls. That is, even if the game we're making fails, it's not the end of the world. Don't carry too much psychological burden." I believe this mental state and attitude are conducive to newcomers' growth. So for Miyazaki, failure isn't just one of his game design philosophies, but also one of his life philosophies. And it was precisely this life philosophy that allowed him to seize what might have been the most important opportunity of his life, becoming the producer of the Demon's Souls project. Speaking of which, the original initiator of the Demon's Souls project was Takashi Kaji, who was working at Sony Japan Studio at the time. He was a fan of From Software's King's Field, and Armored Core series, so he approached From Software, wanting to collaborate on a new King's Field game. King's Field was a high-difficulty dark fantasy action-adventure game released by From Software in 1994, with an overall story background very similar to today's Souls games, all involving content related to swords and magic, Dungeons and Dragons. At the same time, Kaji also proposed the concept of reviving lost action games in this collaboration. From Software was very interested in this collaboration and subsequently dispatched company veteran Masanori Takeuchi, who had previously produced Ninja Blade. However, as we mentioned earlier, the new game's development didn't go smoothly. The team at the time couldn't determine the core gameplay mechanics, leading to a lack of clear development direction, ultimately turning the project into a mess. It was at this point that Miyazaki voluntarily stepped forward. Coincidentally, Miyazaki and Kaji shared a love for books and films of dark fantasy. The two hit it off when discussing stories about King Arthur and Sword in the Stone, which ultimately led them to decide together that they would create a game that would be both enjoyable to play and extremely challenging. After officially becoming the producer of Demon's Souls, the first thing Miyazaki did was establish a new development line within the company and rebuild a new work team, with almost all development staff being veterans over 30 years old. Subsequently, he clarified the new game's worldview, Western fantasy. Regarding the final determination of Western fantasy, many players and media outlets spread rumors that this choice was made because Demon's Souls was positioned as a new entry in the King's Field series, but this was actually just a rumor. Although Kaji initially did approach From Software with the intention of making a new King's Field game, when the game was greenlit, the team decided to create a game with entirely new gameplay and worldview. Regarding this point, Miyazaki clearly stated in a 2009 interview with Game Informer, Demon's Souls was not developed as a sequel to King's Field. While King's Field undoubtedly influenced the ideas behind Demon's Souls, we envisioned this as a completely original game, independent of King's Field. The main reason Miyazaki ultimately chose the same Western fantasy background as King's Field was, besides both he and Kaji being hardcore fans of this genre, another important reason was that there were very few games with this background in Japan at the time. Miyazaki once said in an interview, "What inspired me to create Demon's Souls were European mythological stories and some art outside the video game world. No games ever gave me creative inspiration, but films like Conan the Barbarian and Excalibur, as well as Frank Frazetta's fantasy art, all had a huge influence on my creation." The medieval horror aesthetics of Demon's Souls is itself a product of returning to basics behind the punishing gameplay. Japanese action RPGs traditionally prefer to use Japanese historical backgrounds, but our designers found inspiration elsewhere. The game worlds we played in the past, those game worlds that made us tremble with excitement, were Western worlds, like the Witcher and Warhammer gamebook series. When we made Demon's Souls, we took a back-to-basics approach, which is why it became what it is today. This is very natural. Such a worldview isn't special overseas, but in today's Japan, games with this kind of worldview have almost disappeared. Haven't we all, especially those who actually participated in game development, been influenced by the West? This was just my personal taste. I deeply love Arthur, Beowulf, and Nibelung because they're classics. They showcase the good and evil within human nature. Later, when discussing the game's direction, Miyazaki and Kaji's ideas aligned surprisingly well. On one hand, having decided to create a dark Western fantasy game, the overall artistic style naturally needed to be dark and oppressive. The background story needed to be heavy and tragic, a style that would become characteristic of all Miyazaki's Souls games, from early Demon's Souls to mid-period Bloodborne, to today's Elden Ring. Meanwhile, they both believed that the new game must spark players' sense of adventure, giving them the fresh excitement of discovery and failure, feelings that would persist throughout their gameplay experience. Both also believed that the joy of gaming lies in the process, not in the moment of receiving rewards after completion. The process must outweigh the result. They had noticed that many RPGs at the time were designed around completing tasks and receiving rewards, making the task completion process itself boring and removing the joy of thorough gameplay and exploration. All the fun was concentrated in the moment of turning in quests, which they believed was backwards. On the other hand, they wanted players to feel their progress in the game, not just through equipment upgrades, but through the strengthening of their own abilities. Only in this way could the joy of gameplay be maximized for players. More importantly, they both realized that such games had become rare. Most mainstream games at the time were endlessly pandering to players, lowering difficulty, and piling on meaningless side quests to give players shallow senses of achievement. Therefore, they firmly believed that if they could create a different kind of game, it would find its market. In fact, for both Miyazaki and Takashi Kaji, they knew clearly that what they spoke of wasn't anything new, it was the gaming experience of their generation. In many old games, all these elements were commonplace. Games naturally emphasized exploration and immersion rather than quest completion and rewards. They also featured high difficulty levels with challenging gameplay running throughout the experience, keeping players cautious and actively thinking about different strategies. However, as games evolved, these design philosophies were gradually abandoned. Game developers, seeking better sales figures, began continuously lowering entry barriers and pandering to players, afraid that players would give up if they experienced frustration. In a 2009 interview with 4Gamer, Miyazaki said, "When creating Demon's Souls, my first thought was to recreate a classic RPG using new technology. As I mentioned before, I wanted to recreate on the PS3 those feelings and joys we once experienced in old RPGs. The joy of discovery, the joy of thinking, and the sense of achievement. It's like the thrill of exploring dungeons in games like Wizardry, the fear when encountering enemies, and the joy of finding precious items." Similarly, Takashi Kaji said in the same interview, "Those games that kept us playing through the night contain the most essential joy of gaming. I hope today's players can experience that too." In a 2011 interview with Edge magazine, Miyazaki stated, "Of course, people need comparisons. Demon's Souls has been compared to Diablo, Wizardry, Monster Hunter, and even Bushido Blade, but none quite fit. I think this is because our approach to game design was fundamentally different. Unlike many other action RPGs that build around cutscenes or set pieces, our goal was to let players feel rewarded simply by playing the game, not through completing quests or finding prizes or winning loot, but through the pure experience of playing and experiencing the game." With this philosophy, the decision to create a back-to-basics, high-difficulty action RPG was firmly established. Both Miyazaki and Takashi Kaji agreed that they wanted to return to gaming's most primitive pleasures, letting players complete challenges and defeat powerful enemies through high-difficulty exploration. To achieve this goal, the team ultimately decided that death would be the core design element of Demon's Souls. In Miyazaki's view, the death and failure brought by high-difficulty combat was an essential element of the gaming experience. Only after players fail or die would they be motivated to think about their strategy, making the whole process of thinking and trying incredibly engaging. Additionally, he needed to build a strong contrast in the game. Easy success isn't valued, but only through constant death and torment would players feel an immense sense of achievement and satisfaction when they succeed. This meant that making the game difficult was never Miyazaki's design goal, it was simply a means to help players achieve a higher sense of accomplishment. Regarding death, Miyazaki didn't see it as punishment for players, but rather as education. In his own words, "This isn't a game designed to make you die multiple times, but rather an experience that tests your vigilance of your surroundings and your understanding of the game's systems and content." In the game, armor and weapons aren't made for showing off, but for their attributes and practicality. We really want players to focus on this aspect of the experience, the joy of overcoming challenges by making the right choices. But to achieve this, you need to fail, because only through failure can you learn. The core design of death might sound simple, just increasing the numbers would do it. But in Miyazaki's view, making a difficult game isn't easier than making a simple one. Being strict with players isn't easier than pandering to them. Precisely because Demon's Souls was a game based on death, they had to consider and be careful about more things during design. Because as mentioned earlier, Miyazaki didn't want players to feel he was using death to punish them. He didn't want players to feel uncomfortable when dying. So he was constantly trying to find ways to make players acknowledge that death wasn't the game's fault, but their own. This might sound ridiculous, or like Miyazaki was shifting responsibility, but these were actually his exact words in the 4Gamer interview. Of course, Miyazaki also explained in detail why he wanted players to feel their deaths were their own fault. He saw it as an intrinsic motivation. If players felt their deaths were due to flawed game design preventing them from progressing, it would deal a massive blow to their confidence and make them unwilling to try again. However, if players realized, "This was my mistake," they wouldn't give up their desire to continue playing. Instead, they'd think, "If I had been more careful, I could have made it," or, "If I had timed my attack or dodge differently, I could have beaten this boss." This way, players would quickly regain their confidence and enthusiasm to try again. For Miyazaki, his job was to design the game in ways that encouraged players to make attempt after attempt. He knew clearly that making players lose motivation after death would render everything meaningless and would be a failed design. So he sought to find a balance, maintaining high difficulty to preserve the sense of achievement after success, while also encouraging players to keep trying rather than giving up and closing the game after dying. To achieve this, Miyazaki and the team first designed the soul-dropping mechanic. When players die, their souls, which combine experience points and currency, would drop at their death location. However, if players could return to that spot and retrieve their dropped souls, the death penalty would be greatly reduced. This created motivation for players to continue playing after death. "I must get back my hard-earned money." At the same time, the soul retrieval mechanic also helped players become less afraid of death to some degree. In designing the maps, Miyazaki would create certain hints that players could easily pick up on, whether through the map's atmosphere or scene changes, making dangerous areas look obviously threatening. This warned players to maintain high vigilance if they wanted to venture into such areas. Enemy positions were also fixed, making it easier for players to memorize them and think about different combat strategies. This way, even after dying, players would benefit from remembering enemy positions for their next attempt. Additionally, Miyazaki tried to make player controls feel more precise and responsive. He believed that good control feedback would maximize the reduction of player stress when failing. Summarizing in Miyazaki's own words, "We wanted to create a learning system that makes players feel good, guiding them to think, 'This was my mistake,' so they would choose to try again with a different approach." We received feedback from players describing this as a masochistic game. But honestly, I had no intention of making Demon's Souls that way. Yes, it's a game where you'll die many times, but in some ways, the game design is actually quite lenient on death penalties. Even when you die, it shouldn't feel too terrible. Speaking of Demon's Souls combat design, Miyazaki had decided from the beginning to make it a sword-fighting game. Swords and shields would be the combat core, with slow-paced battles and different movement designs for different weapons. He felt that many popular games of the time, like The Elder Scrolls Oblivion, didn't properly differentiate movement designs between different weapons. At the same time, Miyazaki believed that many Western games pursued a more realistic experience, making players feel like they were on a real adventure. He saw these experience-focused games as more like simulators, emphasizing realism in their creation. But he didn't want this kind of realism, he just wanted to make a game. So he made abstract and symbolic changes in his creation. For example, in the game, weak attacks could be blocked with a shield, but if enemies performed strong attacks, shields would be knocked back. Slashing attacks would do more damage than thrusting attacks, and rolling could avoid attacks even though it looked unrealistic. Miyazaki wanted to pursue this abstraction and symbolism, creating a simple, game-like feel. Of course, he emphasized that there was no right or wrong between his game-like simplicity philosophy and other games' pursuit of realistic adventure. They were just different design approaches. He was also constantly seeking balance in his game-like approach. If things became too abstract or gamified, it would make players feel tired of it. When creating Demon's Souls, besides recreating classic old-school RPG elements mentioned earlier, Miyazaki also established another major pillar of the game, its online system. He once said, "It wouldn't be wrong to call Demon's Souls an online game, as it does have its own online system. I usually play online games and find online systems interesting, so I wanted to add this element to my own game." However, I also felt that online games' social systems put too much social pressure on players, which I found troublesome as it would block players from enjoying the game's fun. So he decided to make it simple, creating a special Souls-like social system that players could enjoy simply and easily. This became Demon Souls' unique Bloodstains and Messages system. Initially, players might not have understood the Bloodstains and Messages system, wondering if it was redundant. Why not just use a regular online game system? On this point, as Miyazaki mentioned earlier, he felt online game social systems were too troublesome and created too much social pressure. When introducing the system to Sony, he compared it to the difference between phone calls and emails. Some people don't like phone calls because they have to speak and make sounds, which creates pressure for many people. So he wanted to change communication to be like emails, as emails compress social pressure to a minimum. Even if I don't send emails at all, don't socialize, I can still enjoy playing by myself. He wanted the online system to exist but didn't want it to pressure players. He wanted to create a situation where players were naturally online without consciously thinking about being online, rather than having to consciously play online. As for the Bloodstain system, he designed it with an emphasis on fun and sense of adventure. The Bloodstains system itself had some impact on game balance, making the game slightly easier by guiding players to avoid danger. This purpose was the same as creating special atmospheres and fixed enemy positions, all aimed at helping players anticipate danger and overcome powerful enemies. Additionally, when other players saw bloodstains in the game, they might smile knowingly, thinking about which unfortunate player had died there. Miyazaki really liked this design, as he said in interviews. When I play Demon Souls at home and see bloodstains where I expect them, I can't help but feel happy, sympathizing with the dead players and thinking, yes, you would die there. Additionally, besides the martial law and blood sacrifice systems, another network feature in Demon Souls is entering other players' game worlds, either as an invader or as a friendly summon. Interestingly, this design was inspired by Miyazaki's personal experience. He described it like cherry blossoms that fade away. When everyone faces difficult challenges, you suddenly form a random connection with someone who shares your struggles. It's a truly unique feeling. In his own words, this idea originated from a personal experience. On a snowy mountain road, cars couldn't move forward and started sliding. The car behind me got stuck too, then the car behind them spontaneously bumped into them. They started pushing them up the hill. That's how everyone could get home. Then it was my turn. Everyone started pushing my car up the hill. I made it home safely, but I couldn't stop to thank those who helped push me. If I stopped, I would have gotten stuck again. On my way home, I wondered if the last person in that line made it home safely. I thought I might never meet the people who helped me. I thought if we met somewhere else, maybe we'd become friends, or maybe we'd argue. You could call it an interaction between temporary companions. Strangely enough, that incident stayed with me. It was fleeting, yet it stayed with me for a long time. Just like the cherry blossoms that Japanese people love so much. Additionally, there are two very interesting development details about Demon Souls. One is about the voice acting and English translation work, and the other is about the game's female protagonist. Regarding the English translation and voice acting, Miyazaki put careful thought into these aspects as well. Players who've played Demon Souls might notice that the game uses very old words like thee, thou, and thy. This was done to make the voice acting feel more authentic to the medieval setting. As Miyazaki said in interviews, since the game is based on medieval Europe, modern American English wouldn't work. As a Japanese development company, we weren't sure exactly how to handle it. But in Japan, games with strong historical settings often use unique language expressions. We believed similar expressions must exist in English too. So we went to Sony and explained this, asking them to select voice actors based on our needs. This shows how Miyazaki is meticulous about details, and this attention to detail ultimately made the game so captivating. Also, Demon Souls' story actually has a designated female protagonist, the Maiden in Black. This design was initially proposed by Takashi Kaji during early development. He felt From Software games always lacked female characters, so he wanted Demon Souls to have a female protagonist. Miyazaki gladly accepted this request and gave direct instructions to the designers, which led to the creation of the Maiden in Black or the Fire Keeper. Miyazaki loved this character, and although it wasn't in his original plans, he admitted the Maiden in Black helped relieve his creative pressure. As he said in interviews, "She's really cute, isn't she?" Most characters in Demon Souls look scary and dirty, so creating the Maiden in Black greatly relieved my pressure in this aspect. During development, when I got tired, I would secretly add new animations for her. In 2009, in an interview with Game Informer, Miyazaki discussed Demon Souls' production cycle, which took about 3 years total and can be roughly divided into 2 phases. The first phase was materializing his vision for each world, which took 2 years. The second phase was after concretizing his world vision, when the entire team began detailed work on art and level design aspects. About a year. 3 years of time, 3 years of effort, his first fully self-controlled work. What awaited Miyazaki was a harsh reality check. Simply put, players disliked this incredibly difficult, dark-themed game with its obscure story because it was completely different from what they were used to. This was actually predictable. When you try something against the trend, you risk alienating players. As mentioned before, Miyazaki and Takashi Kaji knew from the start what they were doing. They determined that Demon Souls wouldn't be a game that pampered players or gave them meaningless satisfaction. For this reason, they deliberately designed high difficulty, requiring players to learn, understand, and master game mechanics, or face constant failure and death. They also decided against the warm, bright, relaxed art style of traditional Japanese RPGs. Instead, they created Western fantasy inspired by European mythology with an overall dark, heavy atmosphere. Combined with deliberately slow-paced combat focused on tactical dueling and strategic choices, it was vastly different from games of that time which relied on rapid button pressing for instant gratification. All these elements made players reluctant to embrace it. At Tokyo Game Show 2008, Demon Souls' first public demo turned into a public execution for Miyazaki and Takashi Kaji. As Kaji said, "Our first Demon Souls showcase at Tokyo Game Show was a disaster. People were initially excited about a dark fantasy game, but they were very critical of the gameplay. Many thought our combat system was unfinished because it felt so clumsy, despite the game being nearly complete. In fact, I don't think Demon Souls suits demo play, especially at exhibitions, because you can't understand the combat logic in a few minutes. Since Demon Souls is an action RPG, people expected it to play like samurai warriors. But Demon Souls is not, so players were confused. What am I even playing? This feeling intensified because the controls weren't based on any familiar games. Only a few players completed the demo, some even quit during character creation. It was really frustrating. Miyazaki himself said in interviews, "Honestly, during development, not being fully understood made things very difficult. We didn't want to follow trends, but we probably ignored too many practical issues, making things very challenging." The disaster didn't end there. Not only did players dislike Demon Souls, but even Sony, the game's publisher, didn't like it. Sony Japan's president Shuhei Yoshida played the game but was still at first bonfire area after 2 hours. Yoshida's verdict was, "This is an unbelievably bad game." You might wonder, wasn't Demon Souls co-developed with Sony? Why did Sony only make such harsh judgments during pre-release testing? If they didn't accept this game concept from the start, why didn't they stop or change it during development? Actually, Sony wasn't entirely villainous in this situation. In an Edge magazine interview, Miyazaki said they knew they were taking huge risks, so they nervously waited for Sony to demand gameplay changes, but it never happened. Sony's representative Yoshida explained, "At Sony, we try to create games for the widest possible audience. We had to decide, should we make From Software make the game easier, or let them follow their creative vision? We chose the latter. Fortunately, it was the right decision." Sony accepted Miyazaki's creative concept. They knew it wasn't mainstream, but didn't expect it to be this extreme. This happened because Miyazaki deliberately concealed certain aspects during Sony reports, especially the game's difficulty. In a 2018 IGN interview, Miyazaki addressed this. Honestly, we didn't really mention this aspect when demonstrating to Sony. We knew how they'd react, they'd make us change it. So I didn't discuss it much in concept presentations. I talked with Sony's Takashi Kaji, who agreed, telling Sony's marketing about the death mechanics and other concepts would be too direct, they'd run away. So we had to be sneaky about it. Regarding Demon's Souls approval, Miyazaki and Kaji mentioned a mysterious Sony tester. In a 2009 4Gamer interview, Miyazaki said, "I struggled with difficulty balance. Once, when the game became easier, Sony's tester said to me, 'No, keep it difficult.' That really encouraged me." So overall, Demon's Souls release was the result of playing smart with Sony. Sony shouldn't be seen as the villain. From a marketing perspective, they weren't wrong. Risk management is natural for any company, and even Miyazaki admitted this was a huge gamble. Still, we should thank those who dared to go against the flow, those brave enough to explore new game genres and markets. This spirit of adventure opened up a new path for gaming. Winter 2009, Demon's Souls officially launched in Japan. All the choices proved right, all the effort worthwhile. Miyazaki's big gamble paid off. Despite only selling around 30,000 copies in Japan's first week and receiving negative reviews, like the game's slow burn pace, players gradually shifted from rejection to addiction. They began understanding the combat logic, appreciating the dark atmosphere, and experiencing unique satisfaction after countless struggles. As word of mouth spread, Japanese sales grew, eventually passing 100,000 units. Even Miyazaki was surprised and overjoyed, noting the stark contrast between this success and the initial failure. The game succeeded truly in Western markets. After Sony Japan's rejection and initial poor sales, Atlus and Bandai Namco took over Western distribution. Atlus handled North American release, initially planning 150,000 units. They sold 150,000 in the first month, surpassing Japan's total sales. By April 2010, sales tripled their initial target. Atlus earned $300,000 that year from Demon's Souls. In Europe, despite launching later, it sold out quickly. This success convinced Bandai Namco to continue partnering with From Software, leading to Dark Souls. 3 years after release, in 2012, Sony admitted their mistake. President Shuhei Yoshida told Game Informer, "Sony's biggest mistake was abandoning Demon's Souls' Western distribution. We failed in both publishing and studio management. We didn't recognize our product's value." From Demon's Souls' modest success in 2009 to Elden Ring's global triumph in 2020, Souls-like games evolved from niche to mainstream. It all started with Miyazaki and Takashi Kaji's bold experiment. Demon's Souls is undeniably the origin of Souls games. Its combat mechanics, death system, storytelling, world-building, and messaging system created the blueprint for all future Souls and Souls-like games, establishing the genre's foundation. Miyazaki said Demon's Souls isn't perfect, no game ever will be. But it revolutionized gaming by daring to be different.